Okay, this is going to sound really weird, but you don't actually need a Bible today, because I'm going to have all the verses on the screen that we're going to go over together. I don't think I'll ever say that again, you don't need a Bible, but... so we're in this study of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I want to rewind a couple weeks, because I preached a couple messages on intentions of your heart, and I started to get some questions from more than one person. There was about 4 or 5 people that came back to me and said, hey, I'm not sure what you meant when you said this and then you said this. And I thought, well, if 4 people are asking questions, there's probably 15 or 20 that aren't asking questions. And Proverbs 10:19 says, where there are many words, transgressions will follow. Which means don't say too much or you'll say something dumb, like it seems that I have done. So I was not clear. So I'd like to back up a little bit, and I want to be clear. And today may feel more like teaching than preaching, because I want to cover some topics that I feel like we've covered, but even as I went back and watched the videos, I think I could have been much more clear. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, we said, good intentions don't guarantee blessing. That was like the main point of the sermon. Just because your heart's in the right place, if you do the wrong thing, God's not going to honor that, okay? Then the very next week, we said in God's economy, righteous aspirations are credited as accomplishments. If there's something you truly want to do and you're prevented from doing it, that God counts that as an accomplishment. I thought, when I wrote the sermons, that they were clear. As I rewatched them, I realized they were not. So somewhere between my brain and the keyboard and the speakers, some things got confused, and I just want to back up, because what happened was people saw this, good intentions don't guarantee blessing, and then righteous aspirations are credited as accomplishments, and the questions were, did you just kind of said the opposite thing, Bob? 1 week you said this, and 1 week you said that. And the first time I'm like, nah, and then the second time I'm like, no, and then the third time I'm like, I probably did. It's like, what's the difference? Like, why is there a difference? So we're going to circle back and we're going to look at intentions, actions, and whether or not God approves or / rewards. We're going to talk about what that looks like, and we're going to get a full biblical picture. We're going to pull in some other texts, because I want to make sure that we're complete. Now, this will not be a comprehensive study on all the intentions of the heart. That would take weeks. Think of this like when you read Proverbs. Proverbs are, here's the way it normally goes. 99% of the time when you do this, you see this. So that's kind of the approach I'm coming at this morning. We all know there are times when you have a great attitude and you do the righteous thing and you're like, what the heck was that? God, I did what you told me to do, and I haven't seen the results yet. Yes, those things happen, but normally, when we have a good attitude and we do what God has called us to do, we will see fruit, okay? There's no timeline attached to these things. I'm not saying if you do something with the right attitude, in the right amount of time, within 7 days, you know, like on Facebook, share this on Facebook and God will send you money. Please stop. Just stop. I shake my head and I want to comment, like, that's not how it works. Jesus doesn't care how many pictures of orphans you share on Facebook, and Facebook won't donate $1. You just look like you're silly participating in these goofy religious games. So I want to clarify the word blessing. In our context, nowadays, if you stay home on a Sunday and you kick on the TV, there'll be a guy on TV who says, you know, if you sow a seed of $5,000, God's going to bless you with $35,000. The nicest way to say this is that guy is a liar. Okay? Blessing does not always mean financial gain. It doesn't mean something good's going to happen to you. When God says that He blesses His people, it's a blessing. It's, I want good for you. Good job. It's approval. Sometimes God blesses financially. Sometimes God blesses with healing. Sometimes God blesses with favor. But a lot of what the blessing is saying, I'm proud of you. Good job. I bless you to continue to do that. So when I say blessing this morning, don't think reward. It's like 5% reward, 95% is knowing you have God's approval doing what you're doing. Now, that's a big deal because for people who are wired like me, what motivates me more than anything is knowing that I did a good job. If at the end of the day I did a good job, and if God could say, Bob, I'm proud of you, well done, good and faithful servant, yeah, that's right, clap. Come on, Bob, give it up. Thank you. Like, that just fires me up. When God, we all want to hear God say, well done, good and faithful servant. Okay? Bring it. I'm just looking here all day. I'm fine. Preach for applause, right? For some of you, you really don't need God to tell you that. Just, you say, hey, I just need to know the right thing to do, and I'll do the right thing, and that motivates me. And for others, what's going to motivate you is, I want to know that I'm in right relationship with God and right relationship with others, and that's why I'm doing the right thing. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter why you're doing the right thing with a good attitude. Even Paul says in Philippians, some people are out there preaching for greed. And he said, but I don't care. As long as they preach the gospel, I don't care. So if your motivation to do the right thing is because you want God to say good job to you, or because you want to do the right thing, or because you want to remain in right relationship with God and others, as long as you're doing it with a pure heart and you're doing the right thing, you're going to find blessing, favor, or approval from God. So with that in mind, let's talk about intentions, actions, and approval. And I'm going to do my best to make this as easy to understand as possible. So I've kind of created a chart, and we'll add to it as we go through. So the first column is your intentions. The second column will be your actions. And the third column, because I didn't want to put the word blessing there and confuse anyone, is God's approval, God's favor, an accolade, I think is the word. Is that a word, accolade? Okay. I think I was saying accolade earlier in the week, and I couldn't figure out why thesaurus couldn't find a word like that. So if you have wrong intentions, if your heart's not in the right place, it really doesn't matter if you do the right thing, if you do the wrong thing, or if you do no thing at all. You're not going to get any favor or blessing from God. So think about the Pharisees. When Jesus was ministering on the earth, in the 3 years he spent teaching in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, he had a lot of interactions with the religious people. Okay, that would be like me, the religious jerks who think they know it all. Okay? And Jesus wasn't particularly nice to these guys, but they weren't particularly nice to him. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is talking to the crowds. Now I want you to imagine there's like a group of pastors sitting over on that side, and Jesus is talking to these people, but he's really talking about the pastors and the Pharisees over there. So he says, guys, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. And he kind of does. For then you'll have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. So Jesus is saying, listen, when you're doing something nice for someone, don't make it a big deal. Like, hey, Randy, I heard you lost your job, and I wanted to give you this $1,000 check. Well, that's way more for me. Like, look how generous I'm being. And Jesus is saying, if that's your motivation, you got your reward. Everybody saw you give it to him. Have you seen the posts on Facebook where the guy's like handing a sandwich to a homeless people, like taking a like, what are you doing? So one of the big outreaches we're doing right now is we're raising money to buy Thanksgiving meals for local families who can't necessarily pay for the meal themselves. There's going to be a hardship. So for $45, if you want to donate $45 and buy Thanksgiving meal, you can drop it in the Giving Center, and we're going to provide a meal for a local family. You'll never know who they are. Last year, the only people who knew who they were me and Candy. Candy would call them, schedule time to pick up the food. I met them here one-on-one at the church. We didn't even double stack people. So it was anonymous. They weren't going to be embarrassed. They weren't going to bump into anybody. We blessed them with food. and we didn't talk about it. It's not talked about outside this room. We didn't advertise on Facebook, look at all this wonderful stuff we did. Why? Because we're trying to love on somebody in secret. Now, there are different outreach events, like we did the Hot Pretzel event a few weeks ago, where we gave out tons of Awakening Alliance Church stuff, but no one's going to be embarrassed to take a free pretzel. I think any one of us would be embarrassed to have to stand up and admit, I'm not sure I can afford Thanksgiving for my family this year. So we provide them the dignity of not embarrassing them. That's exactly what Jesus is talking about. Like, these Pharisees were literally blowing horns, and now we're going to give to the poor. Jesus is like, great, you got your approval. Were they doing the right thing? Yeah, they were feeding poor people. But their heart was in the wrong place. They were glorifying themselves and not glorifying God. As far as God's concerned, if you're going to do it with the right attitude, or don't do it. Because it's the same to Him. It's like when I tell my kids to go upstairs and clean their room, and I say, nope, back down, try it again. Because I don't want you to clean your room with a bad attitude. I want you to clean your room with a good attitude, and we all know how easy that is. That was pretty simple. No one's confused. When you do things with a bad attitude, it doesn't go well. It didn't go well when you were a kid. It doesn't go well at work. Bad attitude, doesn't really matter what you do. You did the wrong thing. So, what if you have a good attitude and you do the right thing? Does God approve of that? Absolutely. This is kind of the way it's supposed to be. This is when life runs smoothly. When you're like, God, I want to do what you've called me to do. I want to do it in a way that honors you. And I'm going to do exactly what you've called me to do. This is how things work. So think about in Genesis chapter 4, we get to the story of Cain and Abel. Cain brings his sacrifice. Abel brings his sacrifice. Abel brings a spotless lamb. Cain brings some vegetables. God refuses Cain's offering, but he accepts Abel's offering, and Cain kind of has a hissy fit about it. And in chapter 4, verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, hey, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? This is like page 3 in the Bible, folks. If you do well, you'll be accepted. And if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So when you don't do what I've called you to do, sin is crouching, it's waiting, it's hunting you. You are on the verge of heading down the wrong direction. Now, I get feedback sometimes that I spend too much time in the Old Testament, so just in case you're about to bust me on the Old Testament, in the New Testament, Jesus said, if you love me, if you have a right attitude and a right heart, you will, what does it say?
Keep my commandments.
Yeah, if you love me, you'll do what I tell you to do. So, if you love me, if you have good intentions, you will keep my commandments. God approves. Those are very basic, biblical, Christian concepts, right? Nobody right now is scribbling furiously like, wow, Bob, that's so deep. Like, that's amazing, right? Everyone's on board? Not Jamie, he's out of here. He's like, done. Heresy. Like, wow, if you think that's bad, it's fine. All right, so next. I have good intentions. I know what to do, but I just don't do anything. Does God approve of that? Not according to the chart, but let me give you some evidence. James chapter 2, James says, if you see someone who's hungry or cold, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm, be filled, without giving the things needed for the body, what good is that? Hey, are you hungry? Yeah. I hope you get some food. It looks cold out here. I am cold. You should get a jacket. Jesus loves you. What you said is Jesus hates you. James says if you know the right thing to do, in fact in James 4, he says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him that is sin. But I had a good heart, and I know my Bible backwards and forwards. Great, but if you don't love people, God doesn't approve. You're not going to get blessing. You're not going to get favor. You're never going to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. You memorized the whole Bible, but you loved nobody. We all on board so far? Okay, now this is where it's going to get confusing, so I'm going to slow down. So we're going to talk about good intentions with the wrong behavior. So here's the story we were studying at the time. King David has kind of settled down. Most of the wars have quieted down, and he decides he wants to move the Ark of the Covenant, which holds the Ten Commandments and Aaron's staff and a jar of manna, which represents the presence of God, from the outskirts of the camp of Israel to the capital city. So think like the Ark is in LA, but the capital is in Kansas City. Geographically, we're all this. So I want to move it off the sides of the country, get it in the middle. Let's put the big K king in the center, in the capital. We're going to worship together. We're going to, God's going to be honored. We're going to bring God to Jerusalem. So they go to Kiriath Jearim, where the ark is, and they load it onto a brand new cart to take it the 10 miles up the mountain to Jerusalem. So good intentions. We want to move the ark to Jerusalem. Wrong actions. You can't transport the Ark of the Covenant on a cart. Why? Because God said you can't. God said it can only be moved by men carrying poles. The poles would slide in on either side. 4 guys would get underneath it, and they'd carry the Ark of the Covenant wherever it was supposed to go, however far it was supposed to go, however steep the hill was. But they decided, since it's 10 miles uphill, and it's going to be a long trek, we'll build ourselves a brand new cart, like they weren't going to use an old beat-up cart they hauled manure last week, and we're going to load the ark on it, and we're going to take it to Jerusalem. They have all these worshipers and dancers, and they're having a big party, and they're celebrating, and they get halfway, and the cart starts to stumble because the ox slips, the ark starts to slide, and a guy named Uzzah reaches out to stop the ark from falling, because if it falls, it's going to hit the ground, and it's going to open up, and that's not going to go well. Well, when he touches the ark, he dies. Because you're not allowed to touch it. You can't, 70 years ago, the men in Beth Shemesh looked at it, and 70 of them died, because the ark had to be covered. Only the high priest could ever look at it, and only inside the Holy of Holies. Why? Because it represents God's holy presence, and it's God's rules. Now, did they know you had to carry it on poles? Absolutely they knew. They had to get it onto the cart. And had they picked it up to put it on the cart, everybody who would have touched it would have died. Okay? Now, you may say, but Bob, didn't the Philistines steal the ark and send the ark back to Jerusalem on a cart 80 years ago? They did. And God was very clear that because they didn't know the rules, he didn't kill them. But once you know the rules, you're held to a higher standard. So to get the ark on the cart, they would have had to use the poles, put it on the cart, and the decision must have been made. I know we're not supposed to do this, but God will give us a pass because it's steep, because it's uphill, we're using a new cart. And the idea that good intentions don't guarantee blessing is that you can't rationalize your way around disobedience. That just because you have right intentions doesn't mean that God's going to honor them. But this is how I feel. Well, I get that's how you feel. I understand you don't want to carry the ark 10 miles uphill. I wouldn't either. Good news, you don't have to. Only the sons of Kohath are actually allowed to carry it. But we hear things like, I don't think God would send someone to hell if they're trying to live a good life. Well, trying to live a good life is failing, and that's self-righteousness. And only the righteousness of Jesus qualifies you to stand in the presence of God. So no matter how much you want to be good, no matter how much you try to be good, you are not righteous apart from Jesus. I don't think God would condemn someone for whom they love or how they identify themselves. Well, he does. God was very clear. But we've kind of morphed into this society of whatever's right for me is right for me, and there is no more right and wrong. There's your right and my right, but in all honesty, you could be wrong, it doesn't matter. It's whatever feels right to me. Listen, God is not on that standard at all. God is the same yesterday, today, forever and always. At no point has God gone, yeah, I should probably relax my standards. You're right. I know I said that was wrong, but if you really want to do it, go ahead. We're disobedient and then claim we had good intentions. But if somebody got hurt, you were wrong. And when you sin, you're hurting yourself. Isaiah 59:2 says, your sin has separated you from your God. That's not a verse that Isaiah spoke to the multitudes who didn't worship God. He spoke that to the Israelites. Your sin has separated you from not the God. Whose God? Your God. He's already your God, but your sin has come between you and God. Sin is a serious offense. It hurts you and it offends God. And regardless of what your intentions were, if you are disobedient to God's word, you don't get blessing, you don't get favor, you don't get credit. God will not give you a pass. He will not look the other way. God doesn't say, well, he meant to do well, but he disregarded my instructions. That sounds mean. But rebellious behavior never results in blessing.
Say that again?
Rebellious behavior never results in blessing. Ever. If what you're doing and what you're living and what you're believing is contrary to what God's word says, you are in rebellion. And it doesn't matter what your intentions were. David had beautiful intentions. I want to take the ark and I want to put it in Jerusalem and it's going to be awesome and God's going to be in the center of the country and we're going to worship God together. But he did some things wrong and Uzzah died. And David got really angry at the Lord. And if you could finish the story in Chronicles, David goes back to Deuteronomy and looks at how the ark is supposed to be moved, and it has to be moved on poles, and it has to be covered, and it has to be the sons of Kohath, and David gets his act together a few months later to go and get the ark, take it to Jerusalem, and God blesses them. But good intentions don't guarantee blessing. It has to be paired with obedience. So far, so good? All right, so this is where we got off track. The next week, we get to 2 Samuel 7. And this time, again, we see David with good intentions, but his actions are prevented, and yet he still gains God's approval and blessing. So David goes to Nathan the prophet and says, I got this beautiful house made out of cedar. Cedar's super expensive. And he says, my house is awesome. And the Ark of the Covenant, God's house, is this ratty old tent that's hundreds of years old that's been patched up. I want to build a beautiful temple to honor God here in Jerusalem. And God comes back through Nathan and says to David, no. No. You're a man of war. You have a lot of blood on your hands. You've done everything I've asked you to do. You're a man after my own heart. And David, I love you, but no. Your son will build me a temple. But I've never asked anyone to build me a temple. I've been happy in the tent, and I'll be fine in the tent for another 30 or 40 years. Your son gets to build a temple, but you don't. So David takes that pretty well, and he starts gathering cedar and gold and iron and all the material, all the bricks, everything that Solomon's going to need or his son's going to need someday to build the temple. Now, had David gone ahead and built the temple, what would that have been? Starts with an R, ends in rebellion. Rebellion, because he was told not to do it. But David doesn't do it. He only stockpiles material. Because he says, I want this temple to be awesome, and even though I'm not going to be there to see it, even though what the desire in my heart will never come to fruition in my lifetime, I want to equip the next generation, I want to equip the next person that they'll be able to build a temple. So Solomon becomes king when David dies. Solomon builds a temple that by today's standards would cost $6 billion. Okay, that's more than SoFi Stadium down in LA. And at the dedication to this temple, Solomon is speaking to the people and he says, my father wanted to build this temple. And then he gives us, it's in Chronicles and Kings, some insight into a conversation David had with the Lord, whether it was David and Nathan or David and the Lord himself, where God said to David, and here it is, you did well that it was in your heart to build a temple for my name. God said, David, good job. I'm proud of you. Thank you. You did well. David got the approval of the Lord for something that he didn't actually do. I know, it's crazy, isn't it? David didn't actually do it, and he got God's approval. Now, she's fine. Now, before you tell me that that's not how God operates, think back to Genesis chapter 22. Abraham is like dying to have a son. God, you promised me I would have a son. I'm 99 years old, and Sarah gets pregnant, and the boy's about 13, so now Abraham's like 112, and he's raising Isaac, the promised one, and God says, hey, take your son, go on a 3-day trip, go to the top of Mount Moriah, and sacrifice your son to me. Now, we read that, and we think, that's ridiculous. God would never tell someone to sacrifice their son. But in that culture, it wasn't uncommon for people to sacrifice their children to their gods. And since Abraham's relationship with God was only about 30 years old, and he didn't have a Bible, he didn't have a preacher, when God said, take your son to the mountain and kill him, Abraham took that seriously. And as much as it hurt and pained him, he takes Isaac up on the mountain. And on the way up, Isaac says, hey, Dad, you kind of forgot to bring a sheep to sacrifice. And Abraham, who's just like sweating bullets and freaking out at this point, says, don't worry, God's going to provide the lamb. And imagine the torment that's going on in his soul as they get to the top of the mountain. He grabs his own son and ties him up and lays the kid on the altar. And as he gets the nerve to pull the knife back, an angel of the Lord says, Abraham, don't do it. And in chapter 22, verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. Did Abraham kill Isaac? No. Did he get God's blessing and approval? Yes. Why? Because he did well, that it was in his heart to do what God called him to do. And even though he was prevented from doing what God had placed in his heart, God said, you did well that you desired it. And listen, some of you feel like a failure because your marriage failed, or because your grown children aren't presently walking with the Lord, or because your job hasn't gotten you where you want it to be, or you wanted to be a missionary and now you're 60 and you think it's never going to happen. I'm a failure. And God looks at you and says, you did well, that it was in your heart that you wanted to serve me, but you were prevented, and I approve of the desire, the righteous aspirations you had. God does not look at you and see failure. Now, if you had a bad attitude, or you chose the wrong action, you got some stuff to repent for. But if you had every intention of doing what God called you to do, and you were prevented by the Lord or something else, God says you did well that you have it in your heart to do what I called you to do. I'm going to stop, so I shouldn't have started yelling, but now I'm going to start coughing. I got a lot of questions about that over the last few weeks. And if I have not yet been clear, are there any questions? Now, I know that I'm not raising my hand. If you have a question, I promise you, 4 other people in the room have the same question. And what I failed to do 3 or 4 weeks ago, I want to make right. I want to be as clear as possible so you guys have a biblical understanding of how God looks at your intentions and your actions. So based on what you heard or something surrounding this, is there something I have still yet not been clear on?